Imagine the weight of a silence that screams. Don't miss the epic saga of Joseph, betrayed, sold, and forgotten, yet destined to rule. Stay to watch as we decode the anatomy of rejection and reveal how God uses your scars to write a masterpiece of grace. You must wait to see the moment a prisoner becomes a prince. Your healing begins here. This is the Bible teaches. Imagine the weight of a silence that screams. In the vast desert of Canaan, the air is thick, heavy with the scent of dust and the relentless heat of a sun that knows no mercy. But there, among the dunes of Dothan, something colder than death was about to happen. Joseph, a young man whose dreams were still larger than his experience, was walking toward his brothers. He carried no weapons, no suspicion. He carried only bread to feed those who hated him, and a robe that, to him, represented a father's love, but to others was the symbol of a wound that never stopped bleeding. Think about it for a moment. How is it possible that the object meant to bring you the most security, your father's favor, became the exact target of the fury of those who should have protected you? Rejection does not grow in a vacuum. It is born in the heart of one who allows comparison to turn into poison. Those 10 men, his own brothers, no longer saw a 17-year-old boy. They saw an obstacle. They saw the embodiment of their own insecurities. And as you watch this account, perhaps you realize that your pain began like this too, in a place where you should have been safe, but were swallowed by the envy of others. Before the sun reaches the horizon, you will understand why your pit was not a detour, but a place of foundation. The violence did not begin with hands, it began with a look. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. It wasn't a compliment, it was a sentence. In that instant, Joseph was stripped of his humanity. To his brothers, he was no longer a son of Jacob. He was a problem to be eliminated. When they surrounded him, the sound of tearing fabric echoed like dry thunder. The robe of many colors, a symbol of distinction and affection, was ripped away with primitive fury. Clothes are taken to take away dignity. Fabric is torn in an attempt to tear the identity that God had placed upon him. It was not a legend. It was not imagination. It was not an exaggeration. The physical pain of the blows was small compared to the abyss opening in his soul as he saw the faces of those who shared his blood distorted by pure hatred. They threw him into a pit, an empty cistern. No water, no light, no way out. Only the walls of packed earth and the sound of his brothers' voices up above, eating bread while he suffocated in the dark. Imagine being there. Feel the cold earth against your skin and the heat of tears that dry before they fall. Absolute rejection is total isolation at the moment of greatest vulnerability. It was there, in the dampness of that cistern, that Joseph's trauma was baptized. He screamed, but the sky seemed made of bronze. He implored, but the answer was the silence of his executioners. How many times have you felt in that pit, where the people you loved decided to ignore your cry while they went on with life as if you never existed? The Bible tells us in Genesis 37 that they sat down to eat bread. Indifference is the cruelest form of violence. It says to the rejected, "Your life is not even worth my fast." But something even more grave happened. Death did not come by their hands, but betrayal became commercial. Joseph was hoisted from the pit not to be embraced, but to be priced. 20 pieces of silver. That was the value his brothers placed on a life, a future, a promise. The trauma of rejection deepens when you realize that those who should have valued you treated you like a disposable commodity. As the caravans of Ishmaelites pulled away, Joseph looked back and saw the silhouettes of his brothers disappearing. In that moment, he wasn't just leaving Canaan, he was leaving behind everything he knew about who he was. Year after year, step by step, the wound of abandonment walks with the exile. Joseph entered Egypt as a slave, but he carried within him a weight heavier than the chains on his wrists. The question that haunts everyone who has been rejected: why me? If God gave you dreams of greatness, why did he allow you to end up in a slave market? Read this again. Man's rejection does not cancel God's election. What Joseph did not yet understand, and what you perhaps do not yet understand in the midst of your pain, is that the pit was not a cemetery. It was an incubator. The hatred of his brothers was the involuntary fuel that would take him exactly where he needed to be. But the path between the trauma and the throne would pass through a place where many give up: the silence of God in exile. This is only the beginning of the fall, but what follows will reveal how a man's soul can be forged in the fire of injustice without turning to ash. It is at this point that the story becomes impossible to ignore. Egypt was not a destination, it was a reality check. Imagine young Joseph, whose eyes were used to the hills of Canaan and his father's open sky, now being pushed through the noisy streets of Thebes. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, sweat, and spices. The sound he heard was no longer the bleating of sheep, but the cracking of whips and the clamor of a language he did not understand. He was a commodity, an object, a body sold to serve the glory of others. But inside that body beat the heart of a man who refused to let trauma dictate his value. They said he was nothing. They showed him he had no rights. But the Bible reveals a detail that changes everything. The Lord was with Joseph. Think about it for a moment. God's presence did not prevent slavery, but it transfigured the slave. In the house of Potiphar, the general of the guard, Joseph did not work for an earthly master. He worked for the master of the universe. He cleaned the floor as if he were preparing the altar of a temple. He managed the accounts as if he were managing the treasury of heaven. And the result was inevitable. Everything he touched prospered. The rejection of his brothers had thrown him into the mud, but the integrity of his soul raised him to the top of the most powerful house in Egypt. But life, at times, has a cruel way of testing whether our healing is real or just a mask of success. When the hands of Potiphar's wife tried to grasp not just his robe, but his dignity, Joseph made a choice most of us would consider madness. He fled. He chose purity over pleasure and truth over convenience. And what was the reward for his obedience? A new torn robe, a new false accusation, a new profound rejection. Imagine the pain of being punished precisely for doing what is right. Imagine the outrage of being thrown into a dark dungeon for being faithful to God and your master. Potiphar, the man he served with excellence, turned his back on him without hesitation. Once again, abandonment knocked at his door. Once again, silence became his only companion. The Egyptian dungeon was not just a physical prison, it was a psychological abyss. There, sunlight was a forgotten privilege. The sound of chains was the background music. Psalm 105 tells us that the iron entered his soul. Feel the weight of that phrase. It wasn't just Joseph's feet that were in shackles. It was his hope that was being crushed by the weight of injustice. Often, your Egypt is the place where you do everything right, but everything goes wrong. It's the relationship where you gave your all and were betrayed. It's the job where you were honest and ended up being the scapegoat. It's the moment when you look at the sky and ask, where is the justice? Where is the promise? It was in the darkness of that cell that Joseph faced his greatest enemy, resentment. He had every reason in the world to become a bitter man. He had every argument to hate God, hate his brothers, and hate the Egyptians. But character is not proven in the palace. It is forged in the prison. Joseph decided that if he could not control his freedom, he would control his attitude. He began to care for the other prisoners. He began to interpret the dreams of others, even when his own seemed to have died under the stone floor. Imagine being there. Imagine watching time pass. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Forgetfulness is a form of slow death. The king's cupbearer, whom Joseph helped, left prison and promised to remember him. But the Bible says with cutting dryness, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Think of the agony of this silence. With every step he heard in the prison corridor, he hoped it was the announcement of his release. And every time the sound faded away, the weight of abandonment increased. It was absolute isolation. If you feel that you have been forgotten by God and by men, if your pain seems to have no end, and injustice has become your routine, know that God's silence is not God's absence. What is happening now is a preparation for something you cannot yet see. The darkness of the prison was refining Joseph so that he could withstand the glare of Pharaoh's gold. If he had not been wounded by betrayal, he would not have the mercy necessary to save a nation. If he had not been forgotten in the dungeon, he would not have the humility to govern an empire. But the people still did not understand what this meant. They saw a Hebrew prisoner condemned to forgetfulness. They saw a man whose destiny seemed sealed by failure. But while Egypt slept, the king of the universe was moving the pieces of an invisible board. The trauma was being transmuted. Pain was being converted into power. Abandonment was being transformed into authority. But that was not the end. And then something even more grave happened during the nights of Egypt's sovereign. This was where everything changed. Because there is a moment when God's silence ends and his voice shakes the palaces of the earth. Are you ready to see what happens when the man the world despised becomes the only hope of survival for the entire world? The climax is about to be revealed, and the reason you were rejected will finally make sense. God's silence is not the end of a story. It is the preface to a miracle that the human mind would not dare to draft. While Joseph inhabited the cold of the dungeon, the empire of Egypt trembled under the weight of dreams that no wise man could decipher. Pharaoh, the god-man of that land, was troubled. 7 thin cows devouring 7 fat cows. 7 withered ears consuming 7 full ears. Panic spread through the golden corridors of the palace, for the fate of a nation hung by a thread of mystery. It was then that the cupbearer's failing memory was finally touched by the finger of fate. Imagine the scene. In one moment, Joseph is sitting on the dirt floor of the prison, surrounded by chains and forgetfulness. In the next moment, he is washed, shaved, and led into the presence of the highest authority in the ancient world. He did not enter the palace apologizing. He did not enter as a traumatized survivor seeking pity. He entered as someone who had been forged in the fire and no longer feared the heat. "It is not in me," he said to the sovereign, "but God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." The interpretation flowed like a river of revelation. 7 years of abundance would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine. The slave whom no one wanted to hear became the only man the world needed to listen to. In a single day, Pharaoh's signet ring was placed on his finger. Fine linen replaced the prisoner's garments. The gold necklace weighed on his neck. Joseph, the rejected, became Zaphanath-Paneah, the savior of the world. But the rise to power is not the climax of healing. A throne can cure poverty, but it does not cure the heart. Joseph's true test was not in governing Egypt, but in how he would govern himself when those who destroyed him came knocking at his door, begging for bread. Years passed. Famine gripped the land of Canaan, and there they were, 10 men aged by guilt, prostrate before an Egyptian governor they did not recognize. Imagine what went through Joseph's mind. He had the power of life and death in his hands. He could have ordered the executioner with a simple nod. He could have let the famine do the work they tried to do in the desert of Dothan. Revenge is a dish that pain usually serves with pleasure, but Joseph knew that if he killed his brothers, he would become just another victim of the cycle of hatred that threw him into the pit. The same hand that guides a soul through the darkness of abandonment is the one now offering you the chance to transform your scar into a source of life. If you feel that your story is being written with the inks of pain, stay with us until the end, for the final revelation will show that no suffering is wasted under the gaze of the eternal. The tension in the palace was unbearable. Joseph tested them. He saw repentance in their eyes. He heard the words of Judah, who offered to be a slave in place of the youngest brother. The cycle of betrayal was finally broken by sacrifice. Joseph could take it no longer. He ordered all the Egyptians to leave. The cry that erupted from his throat was so loud it was heard throughout Pharaoh's house. "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" The words fell like lightning upon the brothers. Terror paralyzed them. The man they had sold was the Lord of the land. But Joseph did not use his voice to condemn. He used it to set them free. "Do not be distressed nor angry with yourselves because you sold me here," he said between sobs, "for God sent me ahead of you to preserve life." It was there, in the center of the world's power, that the anatomy of rejection was revealed in its entirety. Joseph looked at the scars in his soul and realized they were not marks of shame, but maps of a glorious destiny. The pit was necessary for him to learn the depth of dependence on God. The prison was necessary for him to learn patience and crisis management. The brothers' betrayal was the vehicle that transported him to the place where he would save the very lineage that tried to eliminate him. "You intended evil against me, but God intended it for good." This is the truth that echoes through the centuries for you who feel abandoned, betrayed, or wronged today. Trauma is not God's final word on your life. What men planned for your destruction, heaven is recalibrating for your promotion. The rejection you suffered was not a mistake. It was training. You were not forgotten in the pit. You were hidden for a time of manifestation. The conclusion of this journey does not end with Joseph on the throne, but with the restoration of a family that was dead and came back to life. Joseph's forgiveness was not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate demonstration of spiritual authority. He was no longer a prisoner of the past. He was an architect of the future. May this story engrave in your mind an eternal certainty. God is a specialist in using the remains of a disaster to build monuments of grace. Your cry in the dungeon was heard. Your silence was understood. And your robe of glory is being woven on the looms of your own perseverance. Reflect on the pits you have already survived, and know that each one of them was a step toward the purpose that awaits you. Share this video with someone who feels forgotten, and help us bring healing through these eternal stories. The heavy bronze door opens, eeks, and the sound of metal dragging on the stone floor echoes like a funeral wail. In the center of the courtroom, shrouded in the mist of incense and the blinding glare of Egyptian gold, Joseph sits on his throne of authority. His eyes, now sharpened by years of observation and suffering, land on the figures prostrate before him. 10 men, 10 faces he never forgot, 10 names that were engraved in his memory with the fire of betrayal. They are there, foreheads touching the dust, begging for grain, unaware that the man who holds their lives in his hands is the one to whom they denied mercy 2 decades ago. Imagine the pressure of this silence. Imagine Joseph's heartbeat quickening under his fine linen robe. Trauma is not something that simply disappears with success. It is a scar that pulses when the aggressor returns to your field of vision. In that instant, Joseph was not just the governor of Egypt, he was, simultaneously, the 17-year-old boy being pushed into the abyss. Time stood still. The smell of Canaan emanating from his brother's dusty clothes brought back, in a sensory avalanche, the heat of Dothan, the cruel laughter of Simeon, the indifference of Reuben, and the cold gaze of Judah when he handed him over to the Ishmaelites. Think about it for a moment. How would you react if you had absolute control over those who destroyed your youth? Often, we believe that healing means forgetting, but Joseph's story teaches us that true healing is the ability to look at your executioner and not allow their hatred to define your next action. A Joseph was faced with a dilemma that inhabits the heart of every human being who has suffered abuse or abandonment: justice or revenge. Revenge is fast, visceral, and seductive. It promises a relief it never delivers. Divine justice, however, is slow, deep, and restorative. Joseph knew that if he revealed his identity in that moment of raw emotional impact, he would have his brothers back. But he would not have their repentance. He would have their submission, but not the transformation of their souls. It was not a legend. It was not imagination. It was not an exaggeration. What Joseph felt was the anatomy of a titanic spiritual conflict. He spoke harshly, not out of hatred, but like a surgeon who must cut the flesh to remove the tumor. "You are spies," he exclaimed, his voice resonating with the authority of one who rules the world. He accused them, pressured them, and threw them into prison for 3 days. Why 3 days? Because he wanted them to feel the taste of isolation that he felt for years. He wanted the silence of the Egyptian cell to force those men to confront the ghosts they tried to bury in an empty cistern. And it worked. Behind bars, the past began to take its toll. Joseph, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, heard what he had waited 20 years to hear. They began to speak among themselves, not knowing that the governor understood every word of their native tongue. "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother," they said, "for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear." Read this again. Recognizing someone else's pain is the first step toward dissolving trauma. For the first time, and Joseph heard that his agony was not ignored. It was recorded by the conscience of those men. Joseph's weeping, which he had to hide as he left the room, was not just a weeping of sadness, but a weeping of relief. The biblical therapist shows us a powerful truth here. Healing begins when the truth stops being a secret. But that was not the end. The wound of a family does not close with words of remorse alone. It requires proof of character. Joseph knew that the dynamics of that family needed a final test. He didn't just want forgiveness. He wanted redemption. He wanted to know if, faced with an identical situation, the chance to abandon a brother to save themselves, they would act differently. Every chapter of your life up to now has been a preparation for this encounter. Every sleepless night in the dungeon, and every prayer that seemed to have no answer, every tear shed in the anonymity of Egypt was converging at this point of decision. You are not just surviving your pain, you are being trained to manage the destiny of those who once hurt you. But the people still did not understand what this meant. Joseph's brothers thought they were dealing with a capricious ruler. They did not know they were in a divine classroom, where the teacher was the very brother they tried to erase from history. And it is at this point that the story becomes impossible to ignore. The final test was being prepared. It would not involve weapons, but a silver cup. It would not involve armies, but the heart of the youngest brother, Benjamin. The stage was set for the greatest psychological drama of the scriptures, where the past and the future would clash in a cry for mercy. Year after year, step by step, Joseph walked toward the light, but now he needed to pull his brothers out of the darkness. Are you ready to understand how love can be more rigorous than hatred to ensure a healing that lasts forever? The caravan of Jacob's sons was leaving Egypt under a sun that finally seemed friendly. The weight on the shoulders of Reuben, Simeon, and Judah had lessened. Their sacks were full of grain, and most importantly, Benjamin, the youngest, the last living link to Rachel's promise, was safe by their side. They believed the worst was over. They believed the Lord of the land had been appeased by their honesty. But destiny, under Joseph's direction, still had one last and terrible lesson to teach. The air of relief was suddenly cut by the sound of horse hooves galloping furiously behind them. Dust rose, blurring their vision and bringing back the scent of fear. Joseph's steward caught up with them, his face clouded with icy indignation. "Why have you repaid evil for good?" he asked, his voice sounding like the steel of a blade. The accusation was absurd. The theft of the governor's personal silver cup, the sacred object of his divination. Imagine being there, confusion turning into absolute dread. The brothers, convinced of their integrity, made the mistake of every soul that does not yet know the depth of divine tests. They swore upon death itself. "The one with whom the cup is found, let him die, and we will be slaves." Think about it for a moment. And they were sealing their own fate without knowing that the cup was not an object of theft, but an instrument of revelation. The search began. Silence was broken only by the sound of grain pouring from the open sacks. From oldest to youngest, Reuben, nothing. Simeon, nothing. Levi, Judah, Issachar. The suspense grew with every empty sack, like a rope being stretched to the breaking point. And then, the last sack was opened. Benjamin's sack. The cold gleam of Egyptian silver glinted against the desert light, emerging from the middle of the wheat like a poisonous reptile. The impact was devastating. Time seemed to collapse. In a gesture of collective agony, they tore their clothes, the same gesture of mourning their father Jacob had made decades earlier upon receiving Joseph's blood-stained robe. But that was not the end. They returned to the city not as merchants, but as convicts. Prostrate on the palace floor, they saw Joseph standing, a figure of implacable judgment. "What is this that you have done?" thundered the governor. The test was surgical. Joseph declared that only Benjamin would be kept as a slave. The others could return home in peace. This was the exact repetition of the Dothan scenario. Once again, they had a favorite son of Rachel in their hands, and the opportunity to abandon him to save their own skin. Would the story be a vicious cycle of betrayal, or had the trauma finally generated a new consciousness? This was where everything changed. Judah, the same man who suggested selling Joseph for 20 pieces of silver, stepped forward. He did not plead for justice, for he knew that the weight of his past sins did not allow for such luxury. He pleaded for substitution. In a speech considered one of the most moving pieces of human literature, Judah described his father's pain, the death of the other brother, and the void that the loss of Benjamin would cause in Jacob's soul. "How shall I go up to my father if the lad be not with me?" Judah asked, his voice choked with renunciation. He offered to stay in Benjamin's place. He offered to be the slave, to suffer the punishment, to die in Egypt, as long as the youngest went back free. It was not a legend. It was not imagination. It was not an exaggeration. It was the definitive breaking of the cycle of rejection. Judah was healing Jacob's lineage through sacrifice. If this account is confronting the wounds of your own family, subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this powerful healing. The air in the throne room became heavy, almost unbreathable. Joseph looked at Judah and saw, for the first time in 20 years, not the executioner, but a redeemed brother. Hatred had been conquered by sacrificial love. The armor of an Egyptian ruler began to crack under the pressure of pure human emotion. Imagine being there. The silence before the great cry. The tension before the revelation that would change the geography of faith forever. Joseph could no longer contain the volcano of feelings roaring in his chest. The test was over. The family was in spirit, finally reunited under the light of truth. But the people still did not understand what this meant. The Egyptians looked confused at their master, who trembled before a band of Hebrew shepherds. And then, something even more grave happened. The mask of Zaphanath-Paneah fell to make way for the tears of a longing son. And it is at this point that the story becomes impossible to ignore. The climax is not just a reunion, it is the explosion of a grace that no human error can cancel. The air in the Egyptian throne room became so thick it felt palpable. An invisible mist, composed of 20 years of secrets, contained tears, and a justice that cried from the depths of the earth. Joseph, the man who commanded the destiny of nations, stood before an emotional abyss that no wealth could fill. He looked at those 10 prostrate men, figures broken by guilt and fear, and realized that the cycle of trauma had finally met its master. The authority he exercised did not come from the ring on his finger, but from the ability to no longer be a slave to his own past. Imagine the sound of that environment. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of Judah, who had just offered his own life to save Benjamin's. Joseph could take it no longer. The barrier between the Egyptian ruler and the son of Jacob collapsed with a spiritual crash. "Make every man go out from me," he shouted. When the Egyptian guards and servants withdrew, the weeping that broke from Joseph's soul was so violent, so deep, that the Bible says it was heard throughout Pharaoh's house. It was not a cry of sadness. It was the sound of a soul being washed of the poison of abandonment. "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" he asked in the language of his childhood, the language he had not spoken with his family for 2 decades. The words fell on the brothers like an unexpected judgment day. They could not answer. Terror paralyzed them. That powerful man who held the bread and the sword was the boy they had thrown into the pit and sold for coins. They expected death. They expected that Joseph's years in the dungeon would now be charged in their blood. But Joseph, in a gesture of cinematic grace, asked them to come near. "Come near to me," he said, with a sweetness that defied human logic. Think about it for a moment. Joseph's rejection was not just a family tragedy, it was a divine architecture for the survival of a people. He looked at his aggressors and saw not enemies, but involuntary instruments of a larger plan. "You intended evil against me, but God intended it for good, to bring it to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." Read this again. "What men planned for your destruction, heaven recalibrated for your promotion." The anatomy of Joseph's rejection teaches us that trauma, when processed under the sovereignty of God, loses the power to hurt us and gains the power to use us. Joseph was not just a survivor. He was an architect of the future. He sent chariots to fetch his father, Jacob, transforming the old patriarch's mourning into a celebration of life that even death could not erase. The reunion between the father who thought his son was dead and the son who thought he would never see his father again is one of the most potent scenes in all of human history. But that was not the end. And then something even more grave and profound happened when Jacob finally closed his eyes in the land of Goshen. After their father's death, Joseph's brothers feared once again. They thought Joseph's forgiveness was only a facade while Jacob was alive. They prostrated themselves again, asking for mercy. And it was here that Joseph sealed his destiny of faith with a statement that echoes to our day. He wept again and said, "Am I in the place of God?" By refusing to judge, Joseph definitively freed himself from the chains of the dungeon. He did not allow the wound of abandonment to become an identity of revenge. Your story, just like Joseph's, may have begun in a pit of rejection. Perhaps you carry the marks of robes torn by those who should have loved you. Perhaps you have spent years in the silence of emotional dungeons, feeling forgotten by God and men. But the biblical therapist reveals to us today that your pit is not your cemetery. It is the place where your vision is being adjusted to see not just the pain, but the purpose. It was not a legend. It was not imagination. It was not an exaggeration. Joseph's life proves that divine providence is capable of using human malice as the fuel for eternal glory. The abandonment you suffered was not a detour, but an invitation to a destiny you cannot yet imagine. Imagine being there, at the end of your life, looking back and realizing that every tear was counted, every injustice was weighed, and every year of waiting was an investment in your spiritual authority. Joseph ended his days in Egypt, but his heart was in the promise. He gave orders for his bones to be taken back to the promised land, proving that even the throne of the world could not satisfy someone who found his true place in the heart of God. The closing of your pain begins today, when you decide, just like Joseph, that the evil done to you does not have the power to dictate who you will be. Your story does not end in rejection, it ends in restoration. The robe they tore from you was only cloth, but the identity God gave you is eternal. May the echo of Joseph's victory heal the wound of your abandonment today and transform your desert into a garden of divine purpose. Reflect on which pit you need to forgive today to reach your throne. Subscribe and share this message with someone who needs to know that rejection is only the beginning of a great destiny.